Hey, this is Redrame, and today I'm going to be starting a new video series that I've had an idea for quite some time. Basically, just going over the ins and outs of draft mode, both in terms of the actual drafting process and in playing the decks. So I don't want to ramble on for too long here. We're going to be talking about the fundamentals of drafting and deck building. So let's just get right into it. So what are you looking for when you're drafting, and what are you looking for when you're putting together your deck? There are some pretty obvious metrics. Stronger cards tend to be better than weaker cards. I don't really feel like I need to say too much about that. Mana curve matters to some degree, but because of the mechanics of Artifact, where you have 3 lanes and 3 opportunities to play cards of the same mana, and also just the sheer differences in like power level of cards in the basic set. There are some really good cards and some really bad cards. There are a lot of like say 4 mana cards that you're happier playing on turn 5 than a lot of the 5 mana cards in the game, just as an example. So you shouldn't be worrying much about mana curve. On sort of more of a global scale, you do want to have some early game plays, some mid game plays, some maybe a few late game plays. But it's really something that if you put too much thought into your mana curve, it's more likely to hurt your draft than it is to actually help you. Color ratios in terms of like, for example, the 8 rule, or just how many different colors of like cards of one color are you putting in for each hero of that color, can sort of matter. Yeah, I would say just be conscious of how you're doing it. This is definitely more important during the deck building than the actual drafting. You generally don't want to be thinking too much about color ratios when you're drafting, because you could always pick up a hero, you could always throw in a basic hero if you need to. When you're actually deck building, I tend to go off from the 8 rule by quite a bit. Even something, say, in a 3-2 draft, which is probably my most common ratio of draft, I will do something as strange as 20-20 or like 26-14. And it won't really bother me as long as the cards are strong and I'm a-okay with it. It's something that if you go off the rate, like the standard ratio, you need to be mindful of it when you're actually playing a deck, because you need to play colors that are going to be harder to get down more aggressively so that they don't start clogging up your hand. But I would rather just have strong cards than worry too much about color ratios. Synergy is something that's very easy to overrate in draft, but can be very relevant, especially when the synergy involved comes from heroes. For example, Bounty Hunter. If you have a Bounty Hunter in your draft, you want to be picking up paydays. I think that's fairly intuitive. There are a lot of small synergies like that. Some of them are in blue. Blue synergies tend to be a little bit more powerful just because you can see more of your deck thanks to cards like Foresight that are very high priority in draft. But for the most part, it's easy to overrate synergy. So these are kind of the more standard things that you would think about when you're drafting. And I'm saying this is obvious. These 3 are kind of overrated. And I think the things that people really need to be thinking more about when they're drafting are down here, especially Variance, which I have bolded. Basically, Variance is huge in draft just because of what the objective is. If your goal was to get a 50% win rate in draft, suddenly Variance would matter much less than, say, Power. But in draft, you're generally playing to get either a 5-0, a 5-1, or to get through a Swiss bracket in a tournament, which usually takes like a minimum of 5-2, sometimes better than that. So because of that, you want to be able to draft a deck that can beat worse decks very consistently. Or even decks of the same power level if you're, a strong player, things like that. So variance is very important to consider in terms of both how much can your deck screw you. Like, you don't want to be relying on one-off cards to carry your drafts. Like a single Mist of Avernus would be a good example. Maybe 1 in 3 games you'll draw it. And, like 1 in 8 games you'll draw it on turn 1 and actually just be very likely to win the game from that. But it's not going to help you in the rest of your games. And so often I try to avoid splashing green just for running like overpowered cards like that. And also card variance is another thing to consider, just in terms of, will this card be good every single time that I draw it, or do I need to draw it at a specific point in the game or else it will suck? Mr. Avernus, again, makes a good example for this. Just because if you don't draw it on one of the first few turns of the game, it's very likely to be a dead card in your hand. And then finally, room for counterplay. When you are trying to get a very high record in draft, which you are if you're playing one of the standard formats, either being like a phantom draft or a tournament, you want to be aiming to beat the best players, because it's a lot easier to beat bad players with a deck that's aimed to beat good players than it is to beat good players with a deck that's aimed to beat bad players. And so there are a lot of heroes in particular, and also some cards that are very easy to overrate just because of the sheer amount of counterplay potential that they have. I have some examples listed out here. You'll notice that I include Lich, which is obviously still a very strong hero. I just did that to sort of point out that it's more of a factor that you should be considering. You shouldn't immediately dismiss a hero that has a lot of counterplay potential, but rather be mindful of it. So these are sort of just the core the core factors to understand in terms of evaluating cards and trying to build a good deck. Some key drafting principles. Heroes are way better than cards. If you see a good hero and some great cards, you should always be picking up the good hero. Just having strong heroes is so huge because, for one, you get a body that you get to see every single game, and you additionally get 3 copies of a card. So a small variance in terms, like a small difference in terms of hero power level, correlates to a much larger net difference than, saying like turning a really bad card into a really good card. Because as an estimate, you see a card in 1 in 3 games if you're not playing blue. Slightly more than that if you are playing blue. In the games where you don't see that card is doing nothing for you. Whereas a hero will help you consistently win every single game if that hero is good, or it can hold you back every single game if that hero is bad. Later in draft, you want to be focusing on color more than power. This is a gradient process. I see a lot of people drafting with sort of a binary switch. Like at some point, for a while, I'm just going to be drafting the best cards possible. And then eventually, I'm just going to draft cards that fit my deck. This is more of a gradient process, and it takes a little bit of time to get used to it. It's important to always be considering what you currently have and how well the cards fit in your deck. Because a good card that's guaranteed to go into your deck can mean a lot when there are not a whole lot of playables currently in draft. So sometimes it is worth taking a slightly worse card that just fits what you currently have, even sort of as early as pack 2, or even late in pack 1 if you have like a really strong thing going already. For the same reason, a better prior draft means that you should prioritize color more than power. If you already have a really strong hero, for example, you know that you're going to be playing that color, and that boosts cards of that color significantly in value. Whereas if you don't have much going, you're really just looking to try to get something going, and you want to be taking cards with a high raw value. Strong items are better than most cards. You are more likely to see an item than a card. But the downside to items is that they're only good to the extent that they're better than Short Sword and Traveler's Cloak. So a small gap in item power level can make a really big difference. Whereas sort of just usable items are things that you're not really going to care about, and you're just going to find enough of when you take them over filler. But you're not really going to ever consider drafting them over cards that you would actually want. Final principle is that the colors self-balance, because colors that are perceived as stronger are going to be picked more by draft players. It is important to note that this process is done by humans. It is not necessarily objective, and that's going to get into my next topic a little bit. So speaking of which, we have the colors. You'll notice that green is the one that I don't like. I originally had a pretty long rant about green included in this slideshow, but I really wanted to sort of cut down, stick to the point, get this out as fast as possible, and get my key points home. So I decided to cut that out. But anyways, I think that red, blue, and black are all fairly similar in strength, and I usually just go off of what I see early. Good red, like main deck cards, are extra important because there aren't that many of them, and the good ones are really good and really reliable. Cards like Ogre Conscript are just never going to be bad draws. Similarly, good black heroes are extra important, and this is because there aren't all that many of them. And also, Debbie is a pretty low floor, especially if you have to flop Debbie. Flopping Debbie is really bad. 5 health, if you run into a creep, you die to 3 creeps, or you die to 1 creep and no accident, and that's really bad. And for this reason, black flop heroes are especially high priority. There's even fewer of those. I would say that there are only 3 black heroes that you're remotely excited to flop. Thankfully, all of them are commons, Bloodseeker, Bounty Hunter, and Phantom Assassin. But they are high pick priorities because of that. So if you see one, you want to snatch it. You're not necessarily guaranteed to see one ever again. And there are also cards like Iron Fog Goldmine that really encourage you to have a black flop hero. Green is less consistent. Why do I think green is less consistent / less good / weaker / whatever adjective you want to use? For one, it has the fewest good heroes. So you're relying on seeing good green cards, which are not guaranteed, are very high pick priorities, so you're likely to only find the really good green cards in like the first pack, maybe the 10 card pack, if you're lucky. Farvan is a pretty low floor hero. If you're forced to play Farvan the Dreamer in your deck, and you don't have multiple copies of cards like Mist or Arm the Rebellion, you're going to be pretty sad. Prowler Vanguard is a pretty garbage card if it is just a Prowler Vanguard. And the 410 body is definitely not anything to write home about. Also, the best class cards in green tend to be very high variance. I have a lot of examples here of cards that people tend to drool over that can also just be very bad if you're in the wrong situation for them. Mist and Unearth are cards that you want to draw early and you don't want to draw late. People love these cards because they tend to win you games when you draw them really early. But you only start with 5 cards, and you draw 2 per turn. These are not reliable ways to get you to high wins in draft. Arm the Rebellion is not as high variance if you actually... It's not as high a card variance, but it is high deck variance. It requires you to find a lot of the premium minions. A lot of times you want to combine it with stuff like blue and D portals and things like that, and that's really ambitious because if you don't find the exact cards that you're looking for, green-blue tends to be a really bad combination in draft. And so that can flop really hard. It's very feast or famine in terms of how good your deck is. Quorum and Thunderhide pack are I would say are sort of the most reliable of the cards that are on here. The problem is that they're 8 mana and they can be slayed. And slay is pretty premium in draft. And you can also see them coming from a mile. Well, not Quorum as much because it's a rare, but you can see Thunderhide pack coming from a mile away. Low skill cap of green also means that it's a very popular choice. It doesn't take a galaxy brain to play green. And so because of that, people really like to overrate green. And draft it more than they should, and that just makes the overall power level of the class weaker due to the other factors that I mentioned. And then finally, when should you be going which color? With red and blue, it is most important to look at the main deck cards. If you find some really exciting main deck cards, you are pretty guaranteed to find a good red hero or a good blue hero, as long as you find the main deck cards early in the draft. And this is just because there are a lot of them. Whereas with black and green, you want to have a hero before you find the cards. With black, you're pretty much guaranteed to be finding cards. There are just so many good black main deck cards, but the heroes can sometimes be a bit of a struggle. And with green, well, we talked about green. But if you find an actual good green hero, usually you can find enough like solid green cards to make it work. Finally, basic heroes. Ignore this. This was me forgetting to... Oops. Anyways, so with basic heroes, a lot of times people have sort of like their favorite or least favorite basic hero. As you can see, I have my favorite and least favorite basic hero. But it is really important when you're considering basic heroes to try to find one that fits what you need more so than pick the best basic hero. So the first thing you should be worrying about is your color ratio. If your color ratio is really off, run the basic hero that helps that. That's pretty simple. Then fix what I would call a bad poker hand in terms of, do you have 3 flop heroes and do you have a river hero? If you need a flop hero, which is probably the most common reason you would have a bad poker hand, Keith is pretty premium. Keith is very functional on the flop. 6-1-11 is a lot of stats. Fighting Instinct is obviously nothing to really write home about, but 6-1-11 is definitely easy to underrate, even though, sure, Keith is a red hero, and it can be a little difficult to find the supporting red cards. This, as generic filler, I would go by this ordering. I think Jamoy is generally my favorite basic hero. This is obviously assuming that you're already playing blue. You would never want to splash Jamoy or anything stupid like that. The reason why I like Jamoy, I think the thing that people get hung over on the most about Jamoy is battlefield control, or just because battlefield control is almost a strictly worse Cunning Plan or Compel. The thing that people don't realize, though, is that Cunning Plan and Compel are really premium cards in draft if you're playing blue. Like, they are some of the most important cards you can possibly have, just so that you don't lose your heroes early and get snowballed by items. And you don't always find them. And you don't always find them in the quantity that you want. And because of that, battlefield control is perfectly acceptable. And the base effect of Cunning Plan Compel, like, if those cards didn't draw you cards, they would still be draft viable. They just wouldn't be, good. And so because of that, Jamoy's Sig definitely could be worse, is a little bit underrated by a lot of people. And the reality is just that 3-8 and an ability that draws you a card for a blue hero is very solid, as long as you have sort of a blue win condition. Jamoy is not going to win you any games by himself, but he's going to help your other blue heroes win you games. Keith I have rated next just because he's a good flop hero. He's a very solid vanilla, reasonably consistent in that he can flop in front of a creep and be good because he has 1 armor. He can flop in front of a hero and be good because he'll beat the other hero generally. Fighting Instinct, obviously a trash card. You don't want to be running multiple Keiths because with 1 Keith, you'll often have like 1 or 2 windows to play a Fighting Instinct and it'll be reasonably okay. But if you start having them clog your hand, that's going to be really bad. It's going to hurt you a lot. Debbie I have next. I think Debbie gets a little bit overrated by a lot of people. But if you are flopping black heroes and that hero is not named Debbie, suddenly No Accident can be a very valuable asset. The problem is just that it's hard to find black flop heroes. Generally, I like to put a lot of my black heroes not on the flop. And No Accident's value falls off very quickly. 5 health becomes a problem very quickly. And 5 health is also a problem if you need a black flop hero. Flopping Debbie feels pretty bad. And then finally, Farvan. Farvan can work in any position. If you have enough green support cards, Farvan is actually pretty good because of the armor aura and the armor aura from his card helping you keep creeps alive. But there's sort of a critical mass that you need with Farvan in order for him to actually feel good. And generally, I feel like you don't hit that in draft very consistently. So you'll know when to play Farvan. But if you just aren't real, like, if you haven't figured out to play Farvan from these 2 rules, chances are you shouldn't be playing Farvan. As I mentioned earlier, you don't want double and triple basics because every single one of these SIGs is situational, and therefore a lot better when you have 3 of them in your deck than 6 of them in your deck. You want to avoid splashing Debbie in particular because Debbie has 5 health. You don't really want to splash Jamoy either. I can't think of why you would, but so I guess avoid splashing Debbie and Jamoy. And then finally, I thought I would point out that despite this ranking right here, Debbie is my most used basic, and that's just because black heroes are difficult to get relative to black cards, and black is very strong. So a lot of times I feel the urge to really play those black cards. And so that's all I have for this section. The next part is going to be the hero tier list that I've been working on as kind of just a fun project for a while. But I am reasonably confident in it. It definitely has some spicy picks. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next part.